Hi, everyone. This is the Volta TST meeting for June 2nd, 2020. Please be aware that this meeting is recorded and will be posted to YouTube. We have a few items on the agenda for today. To start that off, we have some recognition of top SIB and Volta community members. There's a news or a mailing list post that Ein sent to look for people who have been contributing in an outstanding way to this community. And this is going to be mentioned at the ONF Broadband Spotlight Series in July. To that, there's a form to fill out, which is linked here and was also linked in that mailing message. Please fill this out. I think we need these by, we'd prefer to have them by today, but the form is going to be open until June the 12th, which is the following Friday. With that, we have a few discussion items. The first is this port identifiers issue. I think Kent brought this up. Kent?
Yes. So there's been a little bit of discussion back and forth on how to uniquely identify ports, specifically ports contained under a logical device. So a logical device basically represents an OLT, and then the issue is that all the devices under it, all the ONUs and their ports, also need to be represented in that space. This wouldn't be too difficult normally. My reaction to it was to say, well, okay, we'll just take the port ID and the device it belongs to as a composite key and use that as the unique identifier. Unfortunately,
sorry, hold on. I'm trying to understand why your logical device definition needs to include all the ports on the OLT and the ONU. The logical device by definition should only have the uni ports on the ONU and the NNI ports on the OLT. Why does it need to include, say, the PON ports on the OLT?
So yes, that is fair. It doesn't necessarily need to represent them, but it does need to be able to keep track of them. Like when we're doing routing and things, the routing has to take those ports into account. So we need some way to identify them uniquely. And for this part in particular, that composite key of the device and port ID can be used. So that part's fine. The issue comes in when we look at how ONOS communicates. ONOS is restricted to a 32-bit identifier for ports. So obviously this would be just the NNI and UNI ports, I believe, that actually need to be represented in that space.
Somebody's trying to speak.
Before we go forward, I really don't understand the need of accounting for routing at a logical device of an existing PON port. Can you just not query what is existing in Volta? And why does this even have to be exposed to ONOS? Maybe I'm piggybacking on what Serv asked, but I'm still missing the point.
Okay, maybe I just Kent, is that's okay? I can give some background information here.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so the logical device doesn't account for the PON port at all. So the logical device has only the UNI port and the NNI ports. And the actual devices, the OLT and ONUs, those are the ones that have the UNI ports and NNI ports and PON ports, whatnot. When we get, for example, flows coming in, we will need to figure out a route because their flows are for logical device. So we need to figure out the route between the NNI and UNI port or vice versa. And in order to do that, then we had to query the actual devices to figure out how to build that route, because it's the actual devices that knows about the PON ports. So that's to put that in context. So the logical device itself doesn't care about point ports. It's the actual device that do care about that. And one of the questions that we had was currently in the open flow port that we define, the NNI and the uni port, there's a port number there. There's a port ID, and then there's a port number. The port ID is a label. The one for NNI start with NNI underscore a port number, and the one for the uni is given by the adapter. So typically it will be uni dash something. And at the same time, for that port, we have something called the device port in that open flow port definition. And that is the device port is the actual physical port. But what we are seeing in the code, both the port, the OFP port number and the device port are set to be the same. But can they be the same? And looking at the code in the adapter, the Broadcom adapter, it appears that the adapter itself tries to guarantee that whatever port it sends up when it registers a port, that port number is unique across all the ONUs for that OLT. So I may be mistaken with that or not. So we'll need to have clarification on that. Like, is that port unique? That port ID, is it unique or not? Is there anybody that can help there? Because that will help to figure out like whether we are assigning the correct port number in the core or not.
So my understanding was that there are certain rules that operators had for assigning I'm blanking out right now. I think there were the rules were for assigning uniport IDs. I remember AT&T had these very specific rules for what port number you should assign to a uniport. But I'll let someone else speak. I'm pretty sure there was something like that, but I can't remember. And that's
So I think the AT&T rules were for the NAS port ID in SEDIS to identify a subscriber. That was something related to their OSS BSS system. I'm not sure it was for the physical port identifier as well, but I may be wrong.
Yes, so I don't know. Yeah, I agree with Tio that they had rules for the NAS port, but I don't know if they had any rule on the uni and the NNI port. But to answer Ken's question specifically, yes, the way these uni port numbers and logical port numbers are assigned are unique across a given OLT. That's the way they are assigned right now.
Okay, so it means that the actual port number that we get on the port, forget logical or just say uniport or a port, well, a uniport, that will be unique. That doesn't really represent the physical port on that device.
Well,
it's not the one. For example, if the physical port number is 10, the port number that will be reported in the uniport, that could be something else.
No, I think they're one and the same right now.
Yeah, that's where it's confusing because it's
sorry to interrupt. So I think, Ken, what you're saying is termed as the interface ID down in the adapter. And the port number is a number which is generated by the adapter. The interface ID is something that is understandable by the lower layer, which is BAL in this case. But the port number that is reported to the adapter is generated by the adapter, and it is unique across all the ports within that OLT.
Okay, so it's okay. So it's not an interface ID at all.
No, so the port number is generated using the interface ID.
Oh, that makes sense then. That's why, like, because it means when at the core level, when we are talking about a device port, we're talking about even the physical device port, we're talking about the generated port. We're not talking about the interface number ID. There.
Yes, yes.
So I think there's a 3-tuple, right? There's a interface ID, then an ONU ID, and then a UNI ID, right? That the adapter uses. There's a 3-tuple like that.
Yeah, I saw
where
that.
interface ID refers to the PON interface on the OLT. And then the ONU ID is basically the ONU on that PON interface. And then the UNI ID is the UNI out of a set of unis on that ONU. But the port number that represents that particular UNI port is that's the one that is generated by using some rules. Is that right? Is that
Yeah,
what I just said makes sense?
Sorry, which one is generated? I just didn't catch which one you said is generated here.
No, all the port numbers are generated using some bit manipulation. So the NNI port numbers, the UNI port numbers, the UNI port numbers specifically are generated using a tuple of ONU ID, UNI ID, and PON interface ID. And NNI interface ID is generated using the interface ID reported by the device. So again, some bit manipulation so as to generate unique NNI port numbers towards the upper layers.
Do we know how many bits are used by that generation?
Yeah, so on the chat, I've pasted a link to the file, which is doing this logic in the OpenOLT adapter. So it's documented out there, the number of bits and how it is generating the port numbers for the NNI port, the PON port, and the UNI ports.
So Kent, since the port number is already unique coming up, is there a need to try to make it even more unique in the core?
Well, first there's a couple things here. First is the question of we've been talking about the OLT adapter or both the OLT and ONUs?
Both of them.
Both of them. Okay. So is it unique across the OLT adapter and across the ONU adapter?
It's unique across the OLT devices. Like anything hanging off that OLT, that port number that we're receiving is going to be unique. So what it means is in the port number that we're using in the logical device is correct. It's going to be unique.
Now that's guaranteed with the open OLT adapter. If there's another OLT adapter, is that guarantee still in place?
If there's another open OLT adapter, it doesn't. Well, assuming the
No,
other.
I mean, pick another, not another open OLT adapters, an OLT adapter for a different vendor device. If they're not using the open OLT adapter at all, the question is, are we trying to say there's going to be a precedent that the core requires all ports coming up from an adapter to be unique per OLT? Or is the core code going to guarantee that by hashing them, whatever, coming up with its own unique identifier for them?
It's so, based on what I'm hearing here, the most sense is probably to say that it's the adapter's responsibility. And that's not, I don't think that's in quotes the right answer. I think it's the answer to go with because it's already implemented. Because if that's the case, that's the simplest solution because it means in the core, we can just use the port number as a unique ID and not have to think about which device it belongs to or any of that. It can just be a unique ID. That's the simplest. In if we were to decide to change it, we would basically do the same sort of thing with bit hashing. We just move that logic into the core. I don't think we need to do that now. I don't think that's a priority.
And that's fine. I guess the question is, if we're going to go down this philosophy, if someone ever writes another OLT adapter, we want them to implement this the same way, i.e. guarantee that those ports are unique. How do we capture that in case someone else writes another adapter, so that all of a sudden a new OLT adapter isn't in our environment, and all of a sudden things start breaking?
Well,
I just don't want this to become an ethereal, a conversation that happens in the ether and it's not recorded.
So actually, there should be a design doc, right, that specifies all of these things, requirements for a new adapter to implement, right?
Yeah.
I guess we've always said, leave it to the code, but I can remember, for example, Manuel asking for something like this in some Tiger team meetings, where we actually documented somewhere that if somebody has to write a new adapter, they have to follow X, Y, Z. That is a requirement, and then these are the interfaces that they have to use to talk to the core, to talk to other adapters via inter-adapter messaging, and so on. This is the API that they have to implement. In principle, we have never actually documented something like this in a design document.
And I think it goes to the kind of the certification too. At some point, it will be, hey, this is a certified OLT adapter or whatever, and we'll need compliance tests around that.
Right.
And just to clarify, the actual designation of uniqueness here, it's in the ONU adapter. The OLT adapter, like by default, the ports that we are going to use, even if we go and use the interface port, from a logical agent perspective, it will be unique.
So let me clarify a few things here. I think there is a bit of a confusion. So the logical port numbers, the NNI port number and the UNI port number are assigned by the OLT adapter, and they are unique across the logical device and on that particular device. The PON port on the OLT is assigned by the OLT itself and is unique for that OLT device. And the PON port for the ONU device is assigned by the ONU adapter and is unique for that ONU. And right now it's hard-coded to 100. So if you have another ONU device in that network on the same OLT, it'll still have the port number 100. Is that a problem?
No, that's not a problem. That's
Okay.
all right for the core.
So I hope it's clear to you and Kent. Or I can write that up on Slack also.
Yeah, that will be helpful. Okay. But that's how they, at least in terms of PON ports, we don't assume uniqueness there.
Yeah, there's potentially two PON ports.
Yeah, but that's when we support type B protection, right? We don't do that right now.
Right now, no, it's not supported.
Yeah, that's it's also not an issue for all of this is because I was moving around some logic in the logical device, and there seemed to be multiple identifiers for ports, and I was very confused. So this has been very helpful. Yes. So the only thing to keep in mind then is that the PON ports are not unique per logical device, but those aren't really recorded on the logical device.
The logical device doesn't care.
Well, I know it doesn't care about them, and it doesn't explicitly look at them, but doesn't record them at all. Like, anyways, that's something else I can look into.
Yeah, it doesn't record them. It's part of the device itself. It's not part of the logical device.
Okay.
It's recorded on the device.
Okay. Right. That works well. This means that the things I've been thinking about for the past week are already done. Nice. And we can move on to the next topic, I believe, unless anybody has any more questions on it.
Hi, this is Amit. I had one question on a similar topic, right? So I had submitted one JIRA where we were suggesting that if we could have UUID identifying a physical port. So right now, as Ken said, right, the device ID plus the port number uniquely identifies a port. So either be it the PON port or the NNI port, and that is good enough. But if we have a UUID identifying a port, then it would make life easier to the northbound systems just because it doesn't have to look up on a compound key. So
Would that UUID?
So
Go ahead, Ken.
So a few things. First of all, it depends what you're thinking about as a northbound system. For the OpenFlow agent, as an example, that is in some sense our most common northbound system, and it only accepts the 32-bit port identifier. So creating a string type UUID isn't helpful in that particular case. It might be helpful to think of to have a unique ID for ports, like completely unique, but that would require sort of this extra complexity of assigning it probably in the core and then pushing that down to adapters so they have it, or assigning it to ports whenever they're received and trying to keep them consistent. I'll also say there's a number of complexities with it. Or alternatively, you can just think of a port as being a sub-resource under a device. And if you think about it that way, and it's just like, well, like a port is always attached to a device, so of course I have to go to the device first to get to the port, then it makes more sense to think of it being this composite key. And then you don't need that extra complexity of a unique port. Do you have a specific case for?
So when I say northbound systems, in this case, it would more be on things like enable, disable PON port. We could just pass the port ID in that case, instead of passing the entire port that we're doing right now. And also on the events and matrices that are reported, right? On that, instead of looking up on the compound keys, northbound system could look up on a single key. But as I said, it's not like very big deal for the northbound systems to implement lookup on a compound key as well. It's just a question of convenience. So, but if you think that the complexity of maintaining that key and the lifecycle of that becomes more of a headache, then yeah, I think that we should not think about it.
Okay, I think it is. My suggestion, a possible halfway solution. You mentioned having to pass the whole port in the whatever the call is. An alternative would be to create a message type that is sort of, it only contains the lookup for a port and only have to pass sort of the device ID and the port ID rather than having to pass an entire port. In practice, it probably doesn't matter that much. It's probably about the same difficulty either way, but that might be a way to clean it up without doing a full port identifier unique ID. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Would using a UUID basically turn it into a session ID for the uni that connects and get reset every time a uni is connected and disconnected and give a life cycle there to the upstream systems? Or would we want to try to retain it and have it always apply if we went down that route?
My understanding of ports is that it's most useful to have them be completely unique across, like, if everything is restarted, as an example, like if let's say Voltha crashes, but the data plane stays up. We want it to come back up with the same IDs everywhere so that when Onos reconnects, it doesn't try to repush everything and break data plane traffic in order to get back to a consistent state. So in general, I think ports should be consistent across restarts. I'm not sure if that answers.
Yeah, that helps.
Okay.
Are there any more comments on this topic? Okay, the next topic was also yours, Kent. It was passing the context for logging, pass everywhere or only as needed.
There have been a few patches. Obviously, everything's been held up by the merge freeze, but there have been a few patches I've been reviewing where we were changing to a different model for logging to sort of do tracing and to do tracing across components. We were doing a thing where basically we're passing a span with each request. And with gRPC, this is very easy because the span can go across a gRPC request using context. And this is correct and nice and gives us like sort of nice multi-level tracing information to be able to follow a request. My question regarding this has to do with some implementation details of how that's being implemented. And it looks like the solution taken has been to basically just pass context everywhere so that all the log statements will have a context passed into them so they know which span to log to. And this is being currently, the way I think it should not be done is that this is being sort of enforced. The only way to do logging is with a context and sort of trying to push it so that context is passed to every function in the whole system, even functions that don't do logging.
We did discuss this Monday morning in the brigade call, and I think the consensus was to walk that back and only pass context where needed.
Okay.
But I think that would be it would be needed everywhere that there is a log message, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Continuing with that and assuming that decision was made, my next question has to do with right now when context is passed, not including this patch, but before any of these changes, when context is being passed, it's very useful because context implies cancellation. It means that a request coming in could be canceled by the caller, and it lets you know that the function that accepts a context can abort partway and is capable of being aborted. So it's useful for things like writing to the database. If that takes too long, the request can be aborted and it can sort of safely abort the transaction and go back up the chain, sort of aborting things as required. If we start passing contexts in order to do logging, we lose that piece of information. And so the question is, in cases where
we lose that piece of information, can you just expand on that? I mean, in context in general, if the function to which the context is passed ignores the notification that the context has been closed, we lose it anyway, right? It's
yes.
kind of a canceled by consent. So is your argument that, hey, if we start passing context everywhere, people will stop implementing or paying attention to the cancel on consent?
Well, so it has more to do with, I'm not exactly what you mean by the word consent in that.
You have to respond to the cancel. It's not like the system takes your thread away.
Right. It has more to do with when reading through the code, it is very useful to know if a function will be canceled properly or if it supports cancellation. Right now, that's kind of our the easiest way to tell, because like a function shouldn't be accepting context if it doesn't accept cancellation. And we've been pretty good about keeping extra contexts passing out of functions. So we're not just passing it everywhere currently. So you can sort of trace what can be canceled all the way through the application, and it's useful for that.
Right, but not all contexts support cancellation. So I am struggling with the equivalency of a context equals the ability to cancel. If I pass a context that was created with a cancel option,
right.
Yes,
But
but
like, so in current usage, the only reason that we pass a context, or that maybe it's more accurate to say, the only reason we accept a context in a function is if that function can be canceled. Currently, we don't do that for any other reason. So
yeah, that's not strictly true. Some of the probe stuff was passed to the cancel.
And I think context in the sense of Go, I think Paul can chime in here, because context, if you look at it, it is used in other cases as well. For example, if you look at some of the HTTP implementation in Golang itself, it is used for request scope variable passing over using context, right? Even the spans which are implemented in tracing, right, they are using context for propagation. So span provides, right, all the open tracing methods provide injecting span into context, and then we pass context around.
So yes, I agree that injecting things into context when you're already passing contexts is convenient. But passing, the specific issue I'm trying to get to here is cases where we don't need the full context, we only need span. And all we need, like the only reason we're passing it is to do logging. Would it be better and more clear to pull the span out of the context and pass just the span in cases where context isn't needed, so that we only, like, basically we're passing this extra argument of context, which has a whole bunch of other connotations and things it can imply. And all we need is a one-line helper function to pull a span out of the context and pass that instead. And we'd be able to keep this, basically not have to pass context everywhere. The other thing is
but even if I use span, right, and pass it into the logging method, right, I would have to then pass the span across method. I think this is kind of a limitation, right, in Golang, because it doesn't have that kind of thread local storage, right, which is usually available in some other languages. So you need not take care of, right, maintaining this or passing this execution context related details across the method calls.
So yes, you'd still have to pass the span. That's true, but it's basically the opportunity to pass something smaller, right? Like or something more specific.
I think I would not agree to that, because when you're passing it, it's just a pass by reference, right? Means it's not like copying.
No, I'm not saying it's more optimal. I'm saying it's easier to tell why this is being passed if you pass just the span. Like, we know that a span is for logging, so you know that, okay, logging context is being passed. Instead of when you pass a context, maybe it's logging, maybe it's cancellation, maybe it's something else.
Right. I mean, the problem is context is overloaded, right? And that's not really our fault. That's
right.
You could say that was a misuse in Go itself. I mean, because cancellations can have different purposes in life. One of those purposes is to deal with timeouts and cancellations, and others to deal with kind of a set of values that are being carried with a call sequence. So I'm not sure passing values in a context is a misuse of context. You could argue that that's exactly what a context is for. And the fact that the context in Golang is actually overloaded with life cycle issues might be an issue. My concern is if we pull these things out, today we pull out logging span, tomorrow we pull out something else.
Well, so
and you get this more and more variables as opposed to saying, yeah, I understand this is kind of a grab all bag, but it is kind of that context of the call.
Which is fair. There is a part of this that is just a question of how we want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
My concern is that basically, as you've said, context is overloaded. I know with when we were doing the state changes, the
probe stuff.
Probes, yes. There were a couple cases there where we avoided passing context where we didn't need a context. It was like just pass the probe. There wasn't a need to push it into a context and then pass that. And there were other cases where it was convenient to pass it in context. I just think passing context everywhere through the whole application, it would be cleaner to pass a span everywhere through the whole application. And like that's pretty much the extent of the argument. Is I think it would be cleaner and more readable. But it's one of those cases where it affects every piece of the code, and so I'd like to spend a little bit more time and try to.
If I agree, I think if you're concerned that context can be misused in the sense somebody can cancel, because ideally all the changes which are going in the code, right, are controlled, right? They go to the review. So I believe that kind of misuse would get captured, right?
No, that's not my concern. It's really about like context has a whole bunch of other things. If the only thing we need is span, just pass the span. Like you don't need the whole thing.
If I interpret your concern correctly, it's context is the interface problem all over again. You basically have this generic interface you're passing, and because it's unclear what it is, it says nothing. Passing a context says nothing. It's unclear what the use of the context is and the function that is called. I don't know if it is used for lifecycle management. I don't know if it's used for just passing a tree of resources, effectively, bag of resources or values, right? So if I see a context passed to a function, I can't tell if that function actually handles cancel or timeout, or if it's just using the context as a placeholder for a bunch of values. And I agree that's a problem with context in general. But until Golang says, look, I'm going to be very explicit and have kind of a life cycle context versus, a values context. Do we want to pull that out into each of ours? And again, I'm concerned that, or do we say, look, today we only care about span, so we pass span. But tomorrow, if we end up wanting to pass something else, at some point we want to put these together and start using context again, so we don't have 25 parameters to a function. Exaggeration.
Right.
Go ahead.
Like I think that's the cleanest, because it's in some sense it's the same amount of work, because most of this is a find and replace, right? Like most of it is find and replace where all the log statements are, and put either a span or a context there, and then sort of go up the tree and pass down what's required. I don't think it makes it that much more difficult if we add another thing and in the future decide to put them together, because we have to do a find and replace again anyways. Right? At that point, we can just decide, okay, the thing we're passing is now this. And to replace all uses of span with context again. Like if it becomes an issue like that, we can deal with it. But I'm concerned about solving that too early, right? Like it's kind of overkill for what we're passing, right?
Yeah, I
I'm
think.
not sure. Okay, I do understand, but I think the way context has been designed, right? That has been designed to carry, right, this kind of a context or execution information, right, over the function calls. So what we probably we should feel that we want to just totally differentiate it from the standard context, we can probably look at creating something which is right custom class, right, for this kind of requirement. Because even span I would not be able to pass, because span has been written in a way that it is supposed to be carried over context as part of the tracing API. We probably may have to create a special context kind of.
Well, in most cases, or in pretty much all cases where a request comes in, passes through, say, the Voltha core, and then is sent out, the context will be passed the whole way there, and like that will just continue to work, and it will be passed through properly already. I don't think that's a concern. The concern is in functions that don't need it, where it's basically just like the only reason you're passing it is to do a few log statements.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with that. So I think we probably have. I think we will not do that. So any method where we don't need a context, we will not pass. So I think that decision was taken.
Well, there's two issues. Any method, we already kind of said, if the receiving function is not using the context, yes, that should not be, a context should not be passed. But if the receiving function is doing logging, it therefore needs a context. The problem is if we mix this, it's going to be a little weird, because take a function that actually does a deadline or a cancel and logging. So now we're going to pass to that function a context that contains both, or we're going to pass to that a context and a span, versus a function that only does logging. We're only going to pass a span?
A function that does both, like it, I kind of separate it, the way I've been thinking about it is the separation of sort of like there's mainline functions, like there's your actual core functionality, and that's like you're passing context, you can see the trace going, and then everything else is basically like a helper. And like, do you need to pass everything to all the helpers? That, like,
right, understood.
I agree
that
that
means
it's not perfect.
Does that mean some functions are going to have a context only, and some will have a context, or some will have a span only, or some will have a context and a span, and some will have a span?
So the way I would think about it is either like if a context is already passed, right, or is needed for something else, assuming cancellation, because that's pretty much the only reason currently. If a context is already being passed, then the span can already be carried through by that context. And so we would never pass a context and a span. And in general, that works. There's very few exceptions where we have to sort of build a span and pass a context. Most of the time, our processing comes from northbound requests, and so we can get span from that.
So
but that also means, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we're using context the way they're intended, as sort of these meta arguments that aren't really sort of first-class arguments to the function. They're kind of additional, well, they're context. They're contextual, they're specifying additional information about the environment. I worry about what happens when we want to add a third one of these things, you know, something that's not a span or a timeout. Now we've got cases where we're passing all three in a context, and sometimes we're passing one or the other, and sometimes two. My gut feeling is this is what context was invented for, is to pass these sorts of things where additional information needs to be conveyed to a function, and we should just use it that way.
Yeah, and even the reverse. Let's say I have a function that has I'm passing a context today, and it's doing a timeout and a log, and all of a sudden it decides not to implement the timeout. Do we go back and change the signature so it only does a span now? I think it becomes a support issue if we start pulling this out. Well, I guess I understand the kind of what you're trying to get at, you know, because I relate it back to the interface. An interface says nothing. A context, passing a context says nothing. It doesn't say how the context is used. But that being said, I kind of agree with Scott. We're kind of using it the way I think people expected, the language developers expected it to be used. And yeah, it's overloaded and ugly at times, but I think trying to, unless we're going to go down the road that, look, we're going to only use a context for life cycle issues, and everything else is going to be passed as either an individual parameter, or we're going to create this new structure that is metadata parameter that we pass around. And then I think we've just essentially re-implemented context without the life cycle stuff. And I'm not sure that's the right way to go either. I don't know if that made any sense at all, but end of ramble.
Like at this point, I see both sides. I think we've reached a point where everyone sort of understands the issue. The consensus still seems to be to just pass contexts as is. I think at this point we just take that as the right way forward and leave the discussion until it becomes an issue again.
If you have any information about what the Golang language developers are thinking around some of this stuff, because I know I've seen some articles written about it. I don't know if they've come to consensus themselves or not.
One of the things with context that's odd is that it wasn't part of the core language originally.
Yeah.
It was sort of an add-on for web requests, right? For if you're running a server, you want to pass context, and that was sort of it was an add-on, and then eventually it was pulled into the mainline because it was used so much. So it wasn't as designed as some other pieces of language. Like usually I can say, oh yeah, like here's what the documentation said on this, here's how it's supposed to work, but context doesn't have that. It wasn't made that way.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if the language developers in future versions of the language will change some of it based on that, or there's just too much history, so changing it now is a problem.
I think the issue was that like it wasn't even part of the core language and there was too much history.
Okay, we have 10 minutes to the top of the hour. Are we at the point we can move on to the other two discussion topics?
Yeah. Just for the notes, just mark down that we'll go with contexts. That seems to be the consensus. And thank you.
Alrighty. The next item was, I think, a discussion of the future of OF Agent Pi and whether it should stay in the Helm chart. David?
Yeah, hopefully this will be a quick one. OF Agent Pi hasn't had a commit since, I think, March, end of March, and that was just for a release. And I think it was 20 days previous to that that there was actually a code change. So my question is, right now we still include OF Agent Pi in the Voltha Helm charts as an option. Is there any objection or to just removing it from the Helm chart and considering that archived code at this point? And if people want to pull it in, they can deploy it their own way, as opposed to keep maintaining it in the Helm chart.
I'll say remove it.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to removing it. My gut feeling is that there are still people using OF Agent Pi.
And that doesn't stop. They just wouldn't be able to use the latest version of the Helm chart, which would be the only thing. They could use an existing version.
Yeah, I believe we officially moved to the Golang version by default. So if someone is still using the OF Agent Pi, is doing that consciously and overriding the values.
Yeah, I don't have any issues with that. It would help if you just announce it on the mailing list before you do that, because as recently as last week, I heard that Netsia or someone in Netsia was still using OFH and Pi. So please do inform.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, and the last item was a discussion of port capability included in the port create API. Ken brought this up. Ken, are you?
Yeah, I was talking to myself. Sorry, I was muted. Currently, when we get a port creation message, especially for a UniPort or an NI port, we get a request coming in via a port create API. And once we get that, when it's time to create the equivalent logical ports, we send a request down to the adapter to get the capability of that port, pretty much the details of the OpenFlow ports, like what kind of detail? I can give you some
speed, advertised speed, things like that. Yeah,
exactly, right. So because we get it and then we go back and request that, there is a time where we have to either lock that port, like nobody can use that, or even that area. Currently, we have to look because we don't have a lock per port in the current code as is. So we have to lock the logical agent when we go and get that information. So my suggestion would be: is it possible that when we get the port creation message itself, to have that capability information already attached to that? Is there a limitation in the adapters to provide that information right at that time? Because if we do have that information right at that time, then it will definitely be improving performance quite a bit.
So yeah, I don't see why not, but I'll let someone from Radisys, maybe Amit, answer that, or Girish.
So right now, I don't recall what port capabilities are reported.
It's not reported. We have to make a request to it from the core.
I mean, if there is a request coming from the core, clearly the adapter has some idea about the port speed and peer information, is it?
So your question was when the port capability request is arriving at the adapter, it is then querying the device and then reporting it back, and all this while the lock is being used at the core, slowing things down. Is that the point?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like kind of currently until we have kind of update on port changes, like where each one of them are separated. But in the current design, we have to log the logical device in order to go and grab that information. Because the reason why we have to log it, because you can get a message like a port update that comes in, and the port is not really fully added to that logical device. So in order to remove all those race conditions, when we have a port create message coming in the core, if that message also include the port capability, then that will make things much simpler for the logical device.
So I think to clarify, right? When adapter sends to core a port create, then the core comes back and says, okay, what are your capabilities? It is unclear to me if at that point the adapter actually reaches out to the physical device to learn the capabilities, or it already knows what the capabilities are at that point. But either way, what Ken is saying is that, well, if you could find out the capabilities and know that before you send the create message to the core, and in fact include the capabilities as part of the create message to the core, that will help scale a lot.
Yeah, makes sense. I have to look into the code. I don't recall much about this, so I can get back, probably discuss on Slack.
Okay,
That'd be
thanks.
great.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think Girish, as Girish said, right, I think it's good to look up on that. But I was also wondering, what do we do with this information in the core? Do we pass it through the OpenFlow channel up to ONOS, or what is it used for?
Yeah, most likely, right?
Yeah, it's actually being sent. We create a logical port for that, and then that get passed to ONOS.
Yeah, it's part of the protocol, the OpenFlow protocol, that ONOS will query for a port description, and that port description will also have all of this information. So I doubt the core actually does anything other than just pass that information upstream.
No, we don't do much with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when we're talking about a uniport, the capability of a uniport has to be the intersection of what type of ONU it is and at the real capabilities of the uniport, right? And both of them need to be taken into account to say what the capabilities of the uniport are.
Okay, so when OpenFlow request for capabilities comes in, these are very much Ethernet standard things. I don't have it at the top of my head, but it asks for speed. It asks for if you know who your peer is and what the peer speed is, and does it do auto negotiation or things like that, right? So uniport is an Ethernet port anyway, right? Similarly, the NNI port is also an Ethernet port. So what kind of capabilities, Amit, were you talking about for a uniport that is not an Ethernet capability?
What I was trying to say is that before responding back, right, we need to look into the UNIS capabilities as well as the ONU, right? Whether it's a GPON ONU or XGS PON ONU. Right, so if I have a 10 gig UNI on a GPON ONU, it should still report it as 1 gig, right? Or whatever is the GPON capability. So it has to be an intersection of both of that.
Okay, maybe we just need to investigate to see what actually happens when this capabilities query comes from the core. What is the OLT adapter or even the ONU adapter going through?
Yeah, so right now, quickly looking. Yeah, quickly looking at the OpenOLT adapter code, it just hard codes a few values and sends them back to the core. It doesn't really query anything to the device.
Okay, so for the NNI port, that can be added then for the port create, because hard-coded values. I don't know if that's right or wrong.
Yeah, so we need to really give much more thought into this. As Amit was saying, I mean, it doesn't make sense to report some hard-coded values for different variants of OLT, with GPON or GPON.
Makes sense.
But even for NNI ports, I mean, the port speed could be 100 gig. It could have been downgraded to 40 gig. So
yeah, but how is this useful for anybody, in the upper layers? I mean, at least for now, I mean, who cares? I mean, what are these port speeds?
So the only time I look at port speed is, say you're connecting an NNI port to an upstream switch, right? And for some reason, the link is not coming up. Okay, now if the link is not coming up, the first thing I look at is, okay, is the port speed the right speed for both the switch port as well as the OLT NNI port? Because one could be 100 and the other could be 40, and then things won't come up, right? So that's the only time I actually look at port speed. But other than that, yeah, you're right. I don't typically care too much about all of these advertised features or capabilities of the port.
Yeah. What you say makes sense. I think we should fix this. Let me look into this.
Okay, but even if it's there are benefits from actually figuring all this out. Even if you continue with the hard-coded messages, there are of course benefits of reporting that straight away, so that we don't need the additional call from the core to ask for capabilities. Right.
Got it.
Okay, I think we're at the top of the hour.
Yep. Thank you all for joining this meeting. We'll talk next week.
And I just wanted to remind that we wanted to do a Jira review today, but we'll take that to next week. We are a little less than a month away from the release, so it's a good time to do a Jira review. Please do update your stories. I looked at it last night, and there are plenty of stories that I think are done, but are not marked as such. So please go through Jira and update your stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurav. See everyone next week.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.